careful dim the lights. It's okay. So first, a couple of thank yous. One to Miami Design Preservation League. MDPL changed my life. Of course, it sounds like a 12-step program, but actually it's true. 30 years ago, I came to Miami Beach. I was visiting my dad. I heard there was an Art Deco district here. I took a walking tour from MDPL. I finished the walking tour. I went to a phone booth, made a call to a friend, says, give me the name of a real estate agent. I want to buy a condo in an Art Deco building. I did. A week later, put a deposit on it. My dad thought I was crazy. My wife and I moved down here 25 years ago. It did change my life. And I want to congratulate MDPL because we've seen 25 Art Deco weekend festivals. They get better, they get worse, and this one is sensational. My hat's off to Lori and Rusty for putting together an amazing program, and my hat's off also to Daniel Serraldo, who's really, he and his team have breathed new life into this organization, and if you don't belong and you want to support a worthy organization, please belong and join, even if you're not from here. I also want to thank the Wilsonian. My wife and I have been members here since it opened 20 years ago. We call it the Cheers Museum. It's 4 blocks away. Everybody knows our name. We know everybody else's name. And Tim and his team have come in 2 years ago, and we're so thrilled with Tim, what you and your team are doing, and we've increased our membership level this year. And this is another organization that's really worthy to be a part of. So the topic today is Art Deco in Shanghai and Miami Beach. All of the photos came from this book that we produced. It's a coffee table book for small coffee tables. We did not do the photographs for this book. All of the photos were done by Dick, who is known really as China's first freelance photographer. He did the Miami Beach photos and he did the Shanghai photos. We also didn't write the book. The Miami portion was written by our friend Clotilde Luce, who can say more in 50 words with wit than other people say in 500. And the Shanghai portion was written by Tess Johnson, who's Deke's partner in Shanghai. Together, they wrote 22 books. So I'm going to start with this initial view of Shanghai, just to give you an overview. I'll probably talk for about 50 minutes. So you see here Shanghai, that's the Hongpu River, and that thing that looks like a space needle is the Pearl TV Tower, which when it was built was the tallest building in China up from 1993 to 2007. And the design of it is based on a poem from the Tang Dynasty about the pipa, which is a Chinese musical string instrument like the lute. And according to the poem, the sound of the pipa sounds like different sized pearls being dropped onto a metal plate. Now, there are a few ironies with this photograph. For one, the Pearl TV Tower is located across the river in an area called Pudong, which is an old Chinese warehouse district. You see all those buildings there. Deke took this photograph in 2005. Pudong does not look like that anymore. If you think there's a lot of buildings there then, there are a lot more there now. And cynical Shanghaiers refer to Pudong as Poo Jersey. The second irony here is obviously the theme here is the old looks of the new. The old building is the Cathay House, which is an Art Deco masterpiece. But there was a time 90 years ago when the old was new. And as much as the Pearl TV Tower is the image of Shanghai now, back then, the Cathay Hotel was the image of Shanghai. And the story I'll tell you very quickly about how that started is sort of a story you're going to hear repeated a number of times in my talk. So, the Cathay House was developed by Victor Sassoon. He was a Jew from Baghdad, from a very wealthy family that made its money in opium and invested a lot in India. So Victor served in World War I and came to Shanghai after World War I and decided real estate was really, really cheap there. So he began looking at the real estate on the river, the Hongpu River, that's now called the Bund, which means embankment. It was a name that Victor gave to it. And he noted that all of the buildings were 10 stories in height because the banks of the river were so muddy you couldn't build anything bigger than that. Well, Victor wasn't deterred by that. He sank hundreds of piles into the ground, built a concrete deck, and built a hotel that was twice as high, 20 stories higher than the existing buildings. So that's how the Cathay Hotel got started. Now, what you may want to wonder is, what is this? Shanghai is a powerhouse. Back in the day, 48% of the tariffs in China came from Shanghai. Now it's the largest container port in the world. What does that possibly have in common with this? Miami Beach, Shanghai, a publishing center for all of China. What are we famous for in Miami Beach? This. What could these two cities possibly have in common? And that's the subject of my talk, and there are really two segments to it. The first 5 or 10 minutes is a story about how two people, Nina and I, went to China on a pleasure trip, and we ended up in the middle of all of these exchanges between a lot of worthy organizations and individuals from Shanghai and Miami Beach. And a product, we like to think of all of this is in a very humble way. Miami Beach has encouraged more appreciation of Shanghai's magnificent Art Deco heritage. So that's really the first part, and to me it's really the story of, it's the Forrest Gump approach to historic preservation. Life is like a box of chocolates. You just don't know what you're going to end up. The second portion, which is a longer portion, I'm going to flip back and forth between Miami and Shanghai, and I'm going to focus not just on the buildings, but on some of the individuals and show you things we share in common and things we don't. But first I want to go back to this image and tell you how this whole thing started, which was 12 years ago. So my college roommate Dwayne called me up about 13 years ago. He and his wife Jill led trips to China with the U.S.-China Friendship Association. They said they were leading one. Nina and I said, great, we want to come. Dwayne said, well, you need a cultural exchange project. So we looked at the cities on the itinerary. So Shanghai was the last place on the list. Said, well, Shanghai's got a lot of Art Deco, Miami Beach has got a lot of Art Deco. Introduce us to some people in Shanghai who know something about Art Deco, and we'll figure something out. So, a couple of months later, we got word back. We're going to introduce you to an architectural and engineering firm which has done some renovation work on buildings on the floor. Fine. So we get to China. We went in the summer of 2005. And I can only tell you, if you go to Shanghai, it's some sort of combination between Manhattan, Las Vegas, and China on steroids. It's pretty mind-blowing. So we get to our meeting, which is the last day, and we're driven up to this building, and I turn to our translator and say, oh, this architectural firm, their offices are in the building, right? Translator says, no, they own the building. So we get taken up to the penthouse, which is the 23rd floor. We get off the elevator, and there are all these photographers. Then we go into the Space Age conference room, we sit down. 6 Chinese walk in with more photographers. So the head guy says to a translator, okay, here's the way the meeting's going to work. I'm going to talk. I'm going to show a video presentation, then you're going to talk. Fine. So he starts. Hi, my name is Mr. Xing Tong He. I'm the chief architect of the Shanghai Xiandai. We're one of the 5 largest architecture firms in the world. We have 3,200 employees. We work in China in 20 countries. We're responsible for 75% of all of the construction in Shanghai. Then he starts showing us some of these images of these buildings he's designed. There's a sports stadium, the cultural complex, the Shanghai Museum, which is in the shape of an ancient Chinese pot. And at this point, an individual who's with our group, who's a young Chinese guy with his own architecture firm in Shanghai, elbows me and says, how do you get this meeting? Don't you know Mr. Xing is the most famous architect in China? And he shows us more videos, a new town he's designed, the Pearl TV Tower. He didn't design that, somebody in his firm did. He was working on the largest TV tower in the world in Malaysia. Then he shows the videos. 2010 Shanghai World Expo. He's the master planner for it. It's going to happen in 5 years. The largest World's Fair ever. All these fantastic images. A bridge in the shape of a Chinese dragon that opens and closes. I'm looking at this thing and I'm getting really depressed. What are we doing here? Why are they meeting with us? Don't they know we're nobody? I've got no presentation. This is a disaster. So at this point it's all so bad we decide all we got is humor. It's all we have left. Now before we went to China, we had been told, buy some gifts for your new friends. So Nina and I are thrifty. We went to the dollar store in Washington Avenue, and we bought an oven mitt with the map of Florida on it. So when it was our turn to speak, I said, well, thank you very much for inviting us, and we're really very humbled. Honestly, we didn't know who you were. And our presentation is a little more low-tech than yours. So now we're going to show you our first image. And with that, Nina stands up very proudly, Vanna White style, and begins pointing. And I say, here is Florida, here is Miami, here is Miami Beach. And our Chinese hosts practically fell off their chairs in hysterics. Miraculously, one of the 12 photographers captured the moment. It was casual Fridays in Shanghai. That's Mr. Xing. We had a very animated discussion after that. It sort of broke the ice. We said, you know, Shanghai and Miami, we're much different, but we're international cities. We have all these problems. We have all this flamboyant architecture. We have all this Art Deco. Why don't we learn from each other? Why don't we do some exchanges? Why don't you come to Miami? Nobody knows what you're doing. They love that idea. So we walked out of that on cloud nine. So as soon as I got back, I contacted this institution, Tim. I contacted the Wilsonian. I said, how about this? How about we bring Mr. Xing over the night before Art Basel opens, we bring him to the Lincoln Theater, and we have him do a big presentation. And Captain Leffler, the director at the time, says, great, I want to do it. And Michael Hughes, who's with the Wilsonian team now, did a sensational job of rounding up the support. So fast forward a year and a half, there we are in front of the Lincoln Theater, which at that point was functioning with 400 people. Mr. Xing gave his presentation. We reenacted the elements a little later, and Mr. Xing still has that oven mitt in his office. Well, that wasn't enough, because as we were preparing this, we contacted the Miami Design Preservation League and said, hey, how about Art Deco weekend? East meets West. Well, the Preservation League embraced that idea as well. Beth Thunlaw, Bill Farkas, and a guy named Scott Tim, we began negotiating with the Chinese back and forth, and all of a sudden, 3 months before the event is supposed to happen, we get word. Okay, the Chinese said, we're sending 23 people. We're sending lectures, we're sending books, we're sending everything. And that was 2007, East Meets West Art Deco weekend. Here's the opening event with Dave Dermott, the mayor, Manny Bauer, commissioner, and that's the vice mayor of Shanghai. Here are some of our 23 Chinese who came and had the time of their lives. We had a sharing right here at the Wilsonian. We were a little bit younger. This is what happens in these big conferences. Two sides sit at a table along the sort of board, but it was a very good exchange. On your right-hand side, you see that guy in the blue striped shirt who's sort of bending over? That's Ben Wood. We're going to come back to him. But it wasn't all hard work. We had some fun. We gave them a duck tour. We took them to Mangoes where their eyes just almost popped out. And then as part of all of this, we had learned in our research that if you want to know about Art Deco in Shanghai, you have to speak to this person, Tess Johnston, who works with Dee here, who publishes all these books. So we emailed Tess, we got her email, and we said, how would you like to come and speak at Art Deco weekend? Tess, who has spent her lifetime in the foreign service in safe places like Iran and Vietnam and every place else, did not suffer fools gladly. She says, why would I travel 8,000 miles? If you want me to come, why don't you bring Deke here and we'll do a photography exhibit? So that's what we did, and that was Tess. That's our exhibit. Then after Art Deco weekend, I got an email from a woman named Meg Chung. Hi, I'm Meg from Hutchison, Whampoa. We're a Hong Kong-based conglomerate. We're doing an Art Deco-inspired real estate development in Shanghai. Why don't you provide us with one of your photographs? To which I said, forget one photograph, why don't you take the whole exhibit? So at that point, Jerry Libin, who was a commissioner of Miami Beach, traveled to Shanghai with a delegation, which included George Neary from the convention, the Greater Miami Convention and Visitors Bureau, and Wendy Kalergis. They met with Meg, they met with Deke, they met with Tess, and they all realized that Miami Beach's interest was real. So Deke did the exhibit. Here was the opening of the Shanghai Miami Beach exhibit in Shanghai, their sales center, pretty darn glitzy. And then a few years after that, Jerry Libin, who was a commissioner, helped us, and we brought the exhibit to Miami International Airport. So that takes us through history, so now we get on to what you've come for, Art Deco in Shanghai and Miami Beach. But like I say, it was an unusual thing that happened. What is Art Deco? If you heard the wonderful lecture this morning. You may have gotten a sense of it. I'll give you my description of it. Art Deco was about modernity. If the previous styles in the early 1900s was Beaux-Art, which looked toward classical Greece, classical Rome, temples, columns, statues by Augustus St. Gaudens. All of the influences of Art Deco were modern. So that meant modern art, abstract, Russian constructivism, cubism, the industrialization, planes, trains, automobiles, the machines, angles. We're moving from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy. As David said this morning, form follows function. For all of these new things, however, you needed some familiar things, so something happened in Art Deco that I'll call sampling. So throw in some Egyptian, throw in some Mayan, throw in some tropical, throw in some Chinese influences, so you can still have friezes and pieces of artwork, but they're going to be stylized and they're going to be influenced by some of these previous things. Art Deco didn't get named really until, I think, the mid-1970s. It was just, it outgrew from an exposition in Paris in 1925, and it also influenced not just building, but everything, design of objects, of clothing, of furniture, of lighting. And it morphed, it traveled around the world, and it was often practiced by forward-thinking people. So we'll start with a building in Miami Beach. This, of course, is the Great Park Central. And what you have in a lot of Art Deco buildings is this rule of three. Art Deco buildings are often vertical rather than horizontal, which is more mid-century. So you see not columns, but stylized columns down the middle, on the Park Central on the left. Again, three parts on the right, that's the Imperial. Both of these buildings were done by very famous architects in Miami Beach. The one on the left, Henry Hohauser, the one on the right, Murray Dixon. Between the two of them, they developed about 300 different buildings. Hohauser was from New York, studied at Pratt Institute, came down and moved down here. Murray Dixon was local, but he actually went to New York and worked for Schultz and Weaver. I then show a photo of this guy. If you don't know who he is, you should, because he's one of the reasons we're all here. This was Tony Goldman. Imagine Tony as the Victor Sassoon of Miami Beach. Tony was a successful real estate developer in New York City. He'd been one of the developers of Soho in New York, Green Street, came down to Miami Beach in the early 1980s, decided Miami Beach was ridiculously dirt cheap. Came here, bought 18 buildings, because it's high in Hebrew, which means good, positive, and he was one of the people really responsible for the Art Deco revolution down here. He didn't stop there. He also really did Wynwood 15 years ago. He saw all those great opportunities there. Tony was an unusual guy if you didn't know him. You think of a real estate developer, MBA in finance. Nope. Tony went to Emerson College, got a degree in theater. He was a crooner. The way I like to liken Tony is the rest of us saw the world in black and white. Tony saw it in Technicolor. Passed away 5 years ago. And when I forgot to mention, when I told you about Tess Johnson and her idea of the photography exhibit, well, somebody had to pay for it. So the only person we could think of was Tony Goldman. He was our one shot. We went to Tony, he bought the idea, and I would not be up here giving this talk if it wasn't for Tony, who I think about pretty much every day. So now let's go to Shanghai for a change. And this building could actually be in Miami Beach. It's the Paramount Theater. Notice, and you'll see as we go back and forth between Miami Beach and Shanghai, a lot of these Art Deco buildings celebrate the corner, which you don't really see elsewhere. And you can see the skyscraper influence in this one. You can see the stylized columns, not classical columns, but flat columns. And again, the use of new building materials, masonry that you can't do anything else with. This was bought. It was built in 1934. It was bought a few years ago by a Taiwanese developer who held tea dances there. So now we look at a similar building in Miami Beach, the Plymouth Hotel, designed by Anton Skizlowitz, who is from Kuwait, Croatia, educated at Columbia, came down here because there was no work in the rest of the United States. And David Ledek, the lecturer this morning, alluded to that. Think about it. In the 1930s, when you think of the 1930s and you look at films, all you can see is grainy black and white movies with red lines. That's 99% of the United States. Come down to Miami Beach, there's a building boom. Anton Skislewitz was very much influenced by the 1939 World's Fair. You can see that imagery in this building. So now we go to a government building here, and that's the U.S. Post Office, which was done during the redevelopment area of the 30s. It's sort of Italianate Art Deco. The nice thing about Art Deco is it was this very informal style, and different people did different things with it. It was not a school of Beaux-Arts. It was not a Bauhaus. It just sort of traveled all over the place. And if you go into the post office, you can also see unity of design. You see a really nice floor, you see a mural, and then we go to Shanghai and see what kind of government building we have, and I'll bet you can guess what this is used for. Talk about form follows function. This is the China Aviation Association, and it was designed by a Chinese architect named Dong Daiyu, who was educated at the University of Pennsylvania. A lot of architects from Shanghai went to the University of Pennsylvania. There must be a really interesting story there. I don't know what it was. This is an area of government buildings. A number of the other buildings in the area were bombed by the Japanese. We're lucky that we still have it. Anyone want to guess where this one is? Shanghai. This is the majestic theater lobby, and it looks like an American theater lobby from the Art Deco era. It was designed by Fan Wanzhou. His name was Robert Fan. He was also educated in the United States. And here are some interior shots again, remembering as you walk through these buildings, it's not just the outside. Often it's the inside of unity of design. This one is from the National Hotel. You can notice the furniture, the lighting, the lamps, and the artwork. And now we go to China. On the left is the Grosvenor House, which we're going to see shortly. And on the right is the Morris Estate, which was owned by a family which published the largest English-speaking newspaper in China. Notice the beautiful abstract metal designs and, of course, the great floors. So here we are. Now we're back in China. This is the Grosvenor House, Grosvenor Gardens. It was done by Victor Sassoon. The architect was Palmer and Turner, which was an English firm. It was his go-to firm. Now this building is in the French concession. Back in the time, Shanghai was divided into three areas. The French concession, the international settlement, which was really British, and then the Chinese section. But this was a French concession, and that park in front of it was a very, very upscale set of tennis courts. Now, notice the shape of the building. Again, you see the vertical elements in this and sort of the striations there. This shape actually indirectly came from protests. And this goes back actually to New York City. In 1910, in New York City, there was a skyscraper built called the Equitable Building, and it was 38 stories high, and people were very, very upset because it felt like the light and the air on the street were being blocked. We're familiar with Miami Beach with this issue of height restrictions because we're always fighting variances from architects who want to get higher. So this was going on in New York City 100 years ago. People were very upset about this big, massive building. So in 1916, there was a zoning law that was passed in New York City. Basically, what it required is that as the building got taller, the building would get stepped back, smaller, hopefully to allow more light and air into the street. And they hired a renderer, or actually a delineator, a guy by the name of Hugh Ferris, and he did these drawings of what buildings were supposed to be like. They became very famous. They traveled worldwide. This one actually is not from the New York building, this is from the Detroit building, the Fisher building. But if these images look vaguely familiar to you, you're right. Because if you see Batman movies, you see the images of Gotham City, the great Art Deco Gotham City. Those are lifted directly from Hugh Ferris renderings. So now we go to another building in Shanghai. This is the Gaston Apartments. This was designed by a French firm, Alexander Leonard Vasiri and Cruz. Again, you see the vertical elements. Again, you see the stepped-up nature. But this building is interesting to me for another reason. Tess Johnston lived here, and when she was there, she befriended a very old architect named, let me just see, Shen Zhu. And Shen was actually an architect who worked in the 1930s for a firm called Allied Architects. They did a number of buildings on the Bund. And in the late 1960s in China, you had the Cultural Revolution, which meant that things that were Western and not part of China would get demolished. So Shen was actually at one of his buildings. It was a bank building on the Bund. And the workmen were about to take the sledgehammer to these gorgeous mosaics. And Shen said, wait a minute, why do all this work? Why not just plaster them over? It's so much easier. So that's what they did. This was discovered 40 years later as they were being uncovered. And this was a great thing. And TV crews came to the Gascoigne apartments to interview Shen, and according to Tess, Shen hid. He did not want to be interviewed. He was very, very shy. He died at age 100. And in a very funny way, the reason the buildings in Shanghai and Miami Beach still exist is because we followed a similar arc of history. Think about it. In the 1930s, you had all of this construction. In the 1940s, you had war. Well, Shanghai was occupied by the Japanese for 5 years. Miami Beach, we weren't occupied, but we were busy hosting about 500 million people in the armed services. After the war, things started up again. But in China, in 1949, it became communist. In places like Shanghai, construction really slowed. In Miami Beach, things started up. But at a certain point, all of the construction began moving away from the Deco district, began moving up towards Collins Avenue, the Fontainebleau, when hotels were getting bigger with air conditioning. So these areas in both countries, for different reasons, were left alone. These buildings are useful. So it's sort of nice, it's an interesting parallel. So here, we don't have too many of the high buildings that we do in Shanghai. You know, we're different. We've got a few of the ones on Collins Avenue. You can see the crests that are a little step back on both the National and the Delano, which is a little bit more of an atomic age building. And I should point out that in Miami Beach, we have hundreds of buildings. We've got them in neighborhoods. In Shanghai, they also have hundreds of buildings. But remember, Shanghai is probably 25 times as large as Miami Beach. They're more scattered. So we'll go to some of the smaller buildings. And often in Miami Beach, these buildings, they're very simple. Because remember, it's the 30s, it was cheap. They're like boxes. They were built for $1,000 a room. So what the architects could do is they'd just add a frieze here, a little bit of decoration there, and you could really come up with some variety. Here we are in Shanghai, so here's the French concession area, which is in second area, which has more of these low-scale buildings. I love the one on the right. You can really imagine that more as a cubist painting. Probably not an expensive building to make. Porthole, some interesting fenestration. Those trees, you see the tree there, they were actually imported from France 100 years ago, and it's very important they provide shade in these neighborhoods. Shanghai is brutally hot in the summer and miserably cold in the winter. So here we are in Miami Beach. Again, it's as Clotilde Luce pointed out in the book, it was a really good observation. It's almost like a railroad train, you know, one car passing after another. Each one similar to the next, but each one a little different. And you can see some of those same themes here in Shanghai. You see on the right-hand side, that eyebrow, which in Miami Beach serves a very useful purpose in protecting us from shade, but just a little bit of a frieze on the building on the left. It doesn't take much to make these buildings interesting. Here we are on Ocean Drive. This is a Skislowitz building on the right. Notice these photos are really old. Deke actually was in Miami Beach 9 times over the last 30 years. He loves this place. So the interesting thing about the photos we've got is not only is it 2 different cities, but it's also from varying time frames. In Miami Beach on Ocean Drive, we have a very tough regulation on rooftop additions on Ocean Drive. They have to be set back way so that you really don't see them from the street. So here we are back in Shanghai. I just really like this building on the left. Somehow it strikes me as very Chinese. Even though it has a plaque on it, if you you notice, there is a rooftop addition up there. So in both cities, one of the decorations that we use are these little friezes, and they're not classical friezes, they're more stylized friezes. So here's one in Shanghai. You can see these images, which are really very modern. And this is Miami Beach. Disregard the mosaics below, but that central image is a real frieze. This is actually, back in Shanghai, a real Chinese concept. Shikuman was a type of housing in China where you have a central entrance that opens into a courtyard. And this is probably the last of the Shikuman buildings. They were done in the Art Deco era. And these are some photographs of the entrances, and you can see they're clearly Art Deco. And this is just a nice photo that Deep did. I just put it in here. I think it's really lovely of the Helen Mar building. Beautiful reflection. This is the Amaran Apartments in Shanghai. It's now called the Gaoan Apartments on Gaoan Street. Used to be on Route Cohen. That was the name of the street. This again is an Alexander Leonard building. You can see AL on the terrazzo on the right-hand side. His wife was Russian by birth, Polish by ancestry, and she was a performer. And this building actually is a place for performers and artists. They used to have removable partitions so there'd be different shows there as well. This is the Midget, another one of his buildings. Again, you can see sort of the interesting grill work on the inside and the interesting use of a corner space. And now we're back at Miami Beach, showing the corner. Notice especially the image on the left, that's Deek. The thing I like about Deek's photos, he doesn't necessarily make all of the buildings just look totally heroic. He includes street life in them, so you get really a sense of what they are. But again, there's this idea of the skyscraper, that little point on the Tudor Hotel on the left, and again, the gorgeous use of the corner. And this is the Betty back in Shanghai, a really lovely, beautiful building that just got this fresh coat of paint. There's actually a rooftop addition on it. So infill is a big issue in Miami Beach. So we have this district with all this Art Deco buildings, and when you have a vacant lot, what do you do with it? So the style back in the 1990s was, well, if you have a vacant lot, it's in an Art Deco district, so you make a building that looks like Art Deco. So that's the way it was done then. This obviously is our Miami subs. I think slightly more successful was this Art Deco inspired building in Shanghai. Again, this is the difference in scale. So this is the Jinmao Tower with an obvious bow to buildings like the Chrysler Building, designed by an American firm, Skidmore, Owens & Merrill, considered very, very successful. So now we go back to the issue of infill again. On the right, that's the Cavalier. Lovely, again, rule of three, simple friezes, and it's amazing how nice you can make a simple box look. But on the left-hand side, you see this building with the beam poles and the portholes. This sweet little building, and to the left of it, there was a vacant lot. I actually was on the design review board when the developer came forward. He wanted to put a building next to this little building with the portholes. And the firm doing it was Arquitectonica, and they came in front of us with 3 different designs, and we kept turning them down. Because the building's going to be modern, but it's going to be at a different scale, and what can be compatible, what can work? They finally came up with this design, and I have to hand Clotilde Luce, who testified numerous times and had a big impact. This is a design they came up with, and we all really liked it. It just seems to work. You know, it's a modern building. It doesn't imitate Art Deco, and it's a different scale, but it picks up enough of the cues from the little building to make it really, really interesting. So it's often, when I was on the design review board, the way it felt, you can't tell an architect what exactly they have to do, but when they do it right and you see it, you just sort of know it. So meanwhile, Arquitectonica is another interesting Miami story because they are probably Miami's most important architectural firm. Well, they established a big office in Shanghai. They do a lot of work there, and these are the types of things they do in Shanghai. So we now go to the Jewish Museum, which was a temple, and this was also a Henry Hohauser building. But I'd like to talk about this not from the point of view of architecture, but another element of the times it by, and that's the history of Jews during World War II. Miami did not have a good story to tell. You may have heard of the SS St. Louis, which was a boat that was captained by a very brave German non-Jewish person named Gustav Schroeder, who had 900 Jews he was intending to take to freedom. They all had their visas and passports. They went to Cuba, where they were supposed to be admitted. They were turned down. They went to Miami, where he wanted to leave them. They were turned down by the government. He wanted to scuttle the boat, but the coast, so that the people could get off the boat. The Coast Guard watched them carefully, couldn't do it. He then went to Canada, got turned down. Eventually had to go back to Antwerp. So of the 900 passengers, it's estimated that 300 lost their lives because they returned and had to be in a concentration camp. This happened in 1939. So this is much different from what happened in Shanghai. Because remember I mentioned this issue of visas. Well, Shanghai is a city with 3 different sections that didn't really require visas. So Jews learned that you could emigrate there without anybody asking you for proof. And all told, about 25,000 Jews emigrated to Shanghai, some by the Russian Trans-Siberian Railroad, others took very long journeys. They were assisted by some brave people, including people like Victor Sassoon, and they were actually housed in a ghetto because Japan was occupying Shanghai then. But the Japanese treated them okay for a very simple reason. The Japanese had had a good experience with Jewish bankers before. They figured we might as well keep the Jews around because they may be our bankers when we take over the world with the Germans. You should know that it's an amazing story. The Jewish Museum of Florida is going to be doing a story on the Jews in Shanghai. Nina and I personally know some of our friends who grew up in Shanghai who went on this expedition, and I really urge you to go to that exhibit. It's going to be fascinating. So now here we are back in Shanghai. This is on the building on the left is a printing plant for missionaries. On the building on the right is the Park Hotel. It was designed by Ladislav Hulik, who was actually a Russian POW, believe he was from Poland. It shares the same type of brick. The Park Central Hotel for a while was the tallest building in China, and the Chinese used to say, when you looked at the top, your hat would fall off. And here we are back to the Sassoon House. This is Victor Sassoon's building. It's now the Peace Hotel. It's been taken over by the Chinese government. Inside it is the height of luxury. There is a group called the Old Man Jazz Band that plays there. And we were there 15 years ago and they were old. I'm sure they're being replaced. Victor Sassoon was a bit of a bon vivant. He liked the horses. He lived in this building. He threw lavish parties. He left Shanghai in 1941, and he ended up in the Bahamas, which is where he lived until 1961. This is a building on the left. It's the Liza building. It's on Manching Road, which is another Art Deco building. You can't see it but it's stepped back. But the more interesting story here really is the story of the guy who developed it, a guy named Silas Hardoux. Silas was another Jew from Baghdad, except unlike Victor, he wasn't rich, he was poor. So he came to Shanghai, and he went to work for David Sassoon as a rent collector. Well, he did very well, and he began making enough money so that he could buy buildings. He ultimately became the richest man in Asia, with a net worth of about $150 million. His wife was Liza, his Eurasian wife. That's who he named the other building for. And he was a very unusual guy, because even though he had a lot of money, his office in the winter was really cold. He would keep his overcoat on because he didn't want to run the heat. When he died in 1931, I understand the service was a real mashup. It was a combination of Hindu and Jewish and Christian. He left all his money to Liza, which left many, many people angry. At the time, it was a net worth in present-day dollars of about $15 billion. And I love the explanation of Silas that I read. He was described as an alchemist, an opium dealer, a real estate owner, a miser, a philanthropist, like Warren Buffett with a touch of Caligula. So here are a couple of buildings in Miami Beach. Again, it's getting to be similar, rule of threes, postmodernist dolphins on faces, a little bit of skyscraper action, some eyebrows. It doesn't take much to make these buildings interesting. We're now sort of in the streamline era. At the end of the Art Deco era, you had the streamlining, which was really based, as David said, on cruise ships, modern design, motion, portholes. Here's our great Art Deco lifeguard station. And in Shanghai, here is the Chang Villa. Again, portholes, nice glass. And here's the Kwok Villa, which was owned by a family that owned a major department store chain. So here we are in Lincoln Road, and this again shows some of the flexibility of Art Deco, because the Colony Theater is one of these transition buildings. You know, you notice the Art Deco typeface and the Art Deco facade, but then this barrel tile, which is Mediterranean revival, which was the prevailing style. So it's a little of this, a little of that. And then in front of the building, you have this folly done by Morris Lapidus. Now there's a more interesting story here than just the architecture. I think many of us know the story of Lincoln Road, which was established by Carl Fisher as this Fifth Avenue, Miami Beach, where all the fine shops were. It went downhill. In 1960, Morris Lapidus was brought in to help revive the street. He famously said, a car never bought anything, turned it into a pedestrian mall, created all of these architectural follies, still nothing. When I was here in 1987, the place was a ghost town. I mean, you would go there would be nobody there. Then in 1997, the city did a big redo of the street and made a big investment, and that's when we get to the story of Ben Wood. And this, I think, is a really fascinating story. How many people here have heard of Ben Wood? Raise your hands. Okay, a few. Ben Wood is probably the most influential architect you've never heard of, and he's not a star architect. So here's why he's important. In the 1970s, he was partnered with a guy named Ben Thompson. And Thompson and Wood designed the great festival marketplaces of the era. That's Quincy Market in Boston, South Street Seaport in New York, Bayside in Miami. Now, people sometimes look down their noses at those places. They're glorified food malls. Who cares if they're in old buildings in Boston or in New York? It's just a food factory. I can tell you, I was in Boston at the time in 1975. Nobody was investing in the city. Boston is a financial center. None of the banks would touch it. When Quincy Market opened, it was a smash success. And in my mind, that was the first inkling of a return to the fact that cities could be interesting. Well, in 1997, the city of Miami Beach hired Ben Wood to do a redo of Lincoln Road. So we held about 112 community meetings. The city ultimately made all of these physical improvements, about $25 million. And it was really from that time on that that Lincoln Road began to take off. I don't know what its next iteration is going to be. It's something else. But that was the start of it. Meanwhile, after Ben did this, he got a call from the Chinese. And they said, well, we have some buildings in Shanghai, some old buildings. They were actually part of the Communist Party first meetings in 1949, and we'd like to see what you could do here. So he did the master plan for an area called Xing Tong He in Shanghai, which I can only tell you is so successful that Xing Tong He in China is now a verb, and it means to rehab buildings. So Ben Wood established an office in Shanghai. He's still there. Walt Disney came to him and asked him, please help us design Shanghai Epcot. Ben turned them down. He's now doing projects like this all over China. So I'd like to end now with something totally different. So Nina and I did this effort for about 3 years. We did all these great exchanges with the Chinese. And then in 2008, we got involved with Miami Marine Stadium. And if you haven't seen this building, it's because it's on the way to Key Biscayne, right off Rickenbacker Causeway. It's hard to see. If you pass the Rusty Pelican on your left-hand side, the next exit, you'll see the back side of this building. The spectacular side of it is the water side. Many things happened at the Marine Stadium. There were concerts, there were 4th of July, but it's really most famous for boat racing. It was probably the best venue for boat racing in the world, and when I talk with boat racers about it, they get emotional. and there has not been a race there since 1992, and it's something that we've always wanted to happen. So, about a year ago, I got a call from the guy right back there, Bruce Ross, I see Bruce, who is with ACT Productions. They do many events on Miami Beach, and I think they did the 2015 Centennial, Polo on the Beach, Art Basel events, and he said, we're working with a Chinese businessman who would like to do a boat race. He does boat races all over the world. So we met with Mr. Lee Haoji. Lee, is that you? I see back there. Great. Hi, Lee. Hi. And we showed them the stadium, even though it's not renovated. They were really interested in this. And then several months later, they came back, and we met at Greater Miami Convention and Visitors Bureau. And we then had sort of a ceremonial meeting to see if we can arrange a boat race here. So this time there's the usual exchange of gifts, and this time I was a little bit better prepared. This time I managed to have with me a vintage shirt from Miss Budweiser, which is the most famous race boat in United States history, and give this to Mr. Lee. And we're now working on planning a boat race at the Marine Stadium. So I now just want to end and just sort of step back and sort of look at all of this. And for me, this is why I said Forrest Gump was right. Life is like a box of chocolates. You just don't know what you're going to end up with. I could never imagine that Nina and I spent 3 years on this China project. Then we do something totally different for 10 years. And now, the group that's going to help us bring back the stadium, going to help us do something that we've wanted to do for 25 years, ends up being Chinese. It's just sort of an amazing thing. And I just want to leave with really one final comment. There are people in this world who want to build walls. It's very important to build walls. Well, I'd rather build a bridge. If it's a bridge in the shape of a Chinese dragon, that suits me fine. The way our cities have progressed, from Shanghai and Miami Beach, is because we're open. People have often come here from other places. We've exchanged ideas. We're curious. You can see that in the way all of the exchanges between the two cities took place that I described. You can see it in the way they both evolved, both in Miami Beach and Shanghai, from people who came here from other places, who took other ideas. And to me, that's really the spirit of Art Deco. It's not just the buildings. It's the fact of being curious, being respectful, being engaging. That's the way I think we'll progress, and I want to continue with that spirit. Thank you.